Generally speaking, there are two great ways to sell a product. One of them is to make a good product, and the other one is to just make things up and tell everyone that you did the first. This was the AresGame AGS850. It's one of the top-selling power supplies on Amazon right now. It's an 850 watt model. It is cheap at $70 on sale right now, up to $90 typically, and that made us a little bit skeptical of it. There's this very common and sort of lazy perception that just buying an 80+ gold power supply is generally a safe bet, or that this is the main way you determine the quality of a power supply. But if Gigabyte hadn't already taught us this, this power supply might help further prove that that platitude isn't always the correct path to take. So we're going to be looking at the AresGame 850. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now, and we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So at the time of writing, this power supply was $70. It's, again, typically about $90 at the max, and the next closest competitor at the time of writing was $114. 80+ gold power supplies of 850 watts are typically closer to an average of $150 between Amazon and Newegg for US sellers. And our objective with this review was genuinely getting into it after we sorted top power supplies on Amazon, was to figure out if it actually is that insanely good of a deal or if something else is going on with it. This is actually the 6th best reviewed 850 watt power supply on Amazon in totality. And it's the 14th best reviewed power supply overall, regardless of the wattage. So that's a pretty high up ranking. So we've got a weird one with this one because this power supply claims 80+ gold. It plasters it everywhere. It's got it on the sticker, on the power supply, on at least 3 sides actually, has it on the box. These are stickers that will remain on them until all existing inventory moves through. It claims 80+ gold on retail websites like Amazon. It says it on the official AresGame website, and it says it in the manuals and other documentation. So this power supply leans very heavily on being a cheap 80+ gold power supply. That's clearly the selling point. And ultimately, it's not 80+ gold. We were unable to verify the 80+ gold claims. In fact, the manufacturer verified our verification that we couldn't verify the claims. And so this is a problem because it's not anywhere close to 80+ gold, and people are buying it because of that, because it's one of the easiest things to do for a system builder who doesn't really have the means to understand a power supply. We don't blame you, to just pick 80+ gold as a safety net, as a, this is probably fine, right? That's a fairly high rating. But as a reminder, 80+ is just an efficiency rating. It doesn't mean it's safe to use. It doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't test the protection mechanisms like SCP, OVP, OCP, OVP, or whatever. The part where the review gets weird, though, is that we had to shoot it twice. We shot the whole review, and then in the process of editing it and working on it, eventually we did get a response from AresGame. As normal way, of course, we normally reach out to a manufacturer when our findings greatly dispute theirs to try and understand why that might happen. Sometimes the answer is very simple. It's very commonly the answer is they were lying. But other times there might be a misunderstanding, or we've discovered something that they were unaware of. And these are important things to try and clarify before we publish, obviously, because we have responsibility to both parties, although our primary concern is for consumers. Either way, they did eventually reply, and we accidentally affected some change, not all of what we want to see with this product, but some of it ahead of the review launching, where AresGame has now started pulling down some of the 80+ gold claims and instead replacing it with just a simple 80+ certification. We'll come back to this efficiency chart in a little bit in more detail, but our findings were very simple in nature. Although the power supply passed our protection testing, meaning it didn't explode, so it did better than Gigabyte. Oh, fuck. It also did not meet the claims of being 80+ gold, and you can see that in this plot. The AGS850 was actually below 80+ bronze in our testing, borderline 80+ white label, meaning below bronze, and other aspects left much to be desired as well. But for what it's worth, we didn't encounter any catastrophic failures. Sadly, that's more of a mark of quality today than it should be. It is, however, short of the marketing claims. In trying to give AresGame a fair chance to respond to our findings and explain itself, we received this answer from them, quote, "Our team lab tested again the samples left in the factory. We found some samples reached gold and some samples did not reach gold, and you were right about the ones that did not reach gold." That was weirdly easy and non-confrontational. It doesn't normally work like that, and we weren't really sure what to do with ourselves after that. It actually took several days to completely rework the script, and we don't go into a potential conflict like that expecting resolution or expecting a reply at all. And to be clear, there's not a resolution yet. They haven't done what they really need to do, and we'll get to that in the conclusion of this review, talk about what really needs to be done. But if we give AresGame the benefit of the doubt, it seems like maybe they're open to doing the right thing, even if it's because they saw our gigabyte testing and became afraid of it. But it threw us off, plainly, is all we can really say about it. Normally we get a reply like, "No, you." Although this was a move in the right direction, and we'll go through all the testing too, it's the important part though, the product was still entirely marketed on a premise which, as far as we can tell, and they've now somewhat verified, was a false premise. It's marketed on something that is objectively untrue. These are numbers. They're very easy to prove or disprove because that's what they are. It's sort of what you do with numbers. So at best, it's misleading. It's maybe disingenuous, intentionally or not, and it's definitely worth condemnation to mismarket a product on things that are not reflective of reality. What we can't know for sure is whether this was skullduggery or whether it was AresGame making a genuine mistake. AresGame, in defending itself, said, well, the components have changed. COVID has made it hard to get certain components, and so we've changed the parts that are used to assemble the PSU, and that's why the rating's different. If they're going through that many changes that the rating might change for 80+, they should resubmit the power supply sample and probably make a new SKU. So we're not forgiving them for what's happened here because there are ways to deal with it, and they involve submitting another sample, getting testing, and finding out that you can't call it 80+ gold anymore. But that's an undesirable result, so probably they tried to avoid it. We don't have enough of a history with AresGame thus far to judge if it wants to do the right thing or if it's afraid of a gigabyte scenario. But either way, AresGame asked us what it was we were after, and we said that the marketing should be in line with reality. We explained that, especially with a Western audience, being truthful about a decent 80+ bronze power supply won't hurt them, but potentially lying or being perceived as lying about an 80+ gold one, which isn't, will hurt them. AresGame told us that it had updated the Amazon page. It thanked us for some of the information on Western markets, and that was more or less the end of the conversation as it stands now. Updating the Amazon page to get rid of the 80+ gold claims is the right direction, but there's a few problems with this. One of them, the listing remains, and so this should really be a different SKU, because what they're doing is co-opting their own listing with what is functionally a new product, benefiting from all of the page rank, the search rank on Amazon, which is very hard to accumulate, and running underneath that product the whole list of pre-existing user reviews for something which this is, at this point, no longer. So that's part of the problem with doing it that way. Another problem is that users who have already purchased this potentially have one like ours. We bought this retail. So you might have something, if you bought it, that is not as advertised. That's a problem. Additionally, any existing reviews, references, and build guides, videos, whatever, will be linking back to a page which was once marketed as one thing, gold, and is now listed as another thing, 80+ blank. So it's not a fix. It's a Band-Aid. What AresGame needs to do is create a new listing. But anyway, let's get into the real testing and start talking about some of the numbers. Now that we've gotten through the bulk of the efficiency stuff, that's really where the potential scandal was. How they deal with it in the next week or so is really what's going to dictate what happens to this product. But we can at least talk about if it's worth it if we ignore the 80+ factor. The rest of the power supply's marketing is pretty convincing. It makes bold claims like stable supply, less spend, get one, win all, and gamer's partner, gaming's mate. And although it's fun and easy to make fun of marketing like this, The power supply also has some maybe more impressive claims. It claims it offers a 10-year warranty with fairly standard coverage for the most part, which remains competitive at the price if you can trust AresGame to stick around that long. We're not saying that as an undeserved dig at AresGame. It's just a statement of reality. It was started last year. It's a sub-brand of a major OEM that claims it has been around for 15 years now. The company also makes lofty claims about its performance. AresGame says it can achieve the highest possible overclock. It also plainly claims 90% efficiency at 115 volt AC, which is a number we can actually put to the test. This power supply does actually have an 80+ report, so it's not like they just took the sticker and put it on there, which you could also do. From what we can tell, it appears as if there's an actual clear result for the power supply being 80+ gold. Now, as for how that happens, if it is in fact not 80+ gold, there's really two main ways. One would be a company submitting potentially a fraudulent sample, which was designed to pass certain bars with no intent of selling it that way. We're not saying that's what happened here, but that is one of the two main ways this could happen. The other way is maybe they had a golden sample wherein the power supply happened to test extremely good. It came from a particularly good batch that would never be created again or is created rarely, and that could also get a high rating that is then applied to every power supply, even the ones that don't do as well because maybe they use lower tier components. For key issues we'll be talking about, obviously there's the efficiency angle. We'll also be going over the noisy output signals, the load regulation sort of inadequacies that we discovered where it was just not great. Voltage ripple was pretty high. We observed significant voltage variance from the lowest end of the tested loads to the heaviest loads that we tested. And additionally, we're a bit suspicious about the claims of the bearing that's in this fan as well. It goes that low level. Now, it's possible you could get this unit for 50 to 70% of the price of a competitor's actually 80+ gold, actually has the bearing it claims power supply at 850 watts. You might decide the benefit there outweighs the shortcomings in terms of the cost benefit from this versus not technically being what it's claiming. We didn't have a catastrophic failure. So as we've tested it, we haven't seen anything that causes us safety concern other than maybe being just generally concerned about what else might be wrong with it. But if you're willing to trade off the fact that it's not truly 80+ gold for the fact that it's cheap, well, it's still something for you to consider buying. But that's entirely on you at that point. You have agency here. You should be the one making that decision if which of those things you value higher than the other, the money or buying the product that is represented the way it actually exists. Speaking strictly for ourselves, Patrick Stone and I have the same view on it, which is that with the power delivery component, once there's a significant call to question of the integrity of the claims, there's enough other options there where we feel a little bit uncomfortable using it in one of our computers. But again, we haven't actually discovered a catastrophic failure. It's more of just a general concern, and you can ignore that if you'd like. It's up to you. Time to get into some of the numbers for this. We're still adding to our power supply testing. It's relatively new to our test suite overall, so there's still stuff we'd like to add later, but we have a pretty well-rounded suite at this point, so let's get started.
For a bit of component analysis on this PSU, we're just going to kind of open it up, sort of teardown style. It's already been disassembled. Again, please always be cautious when working with PSUs. We don't recommend anyone open or work on them unless you absolutely know what you're doing. This particular one has been discharged, and we know that there's no charge left in this thing at all. The modular connectors have no filtering around them, which usually on power supplies you're going to see a few filtering caps around here. But in this case, they chose to put the filtering caps all on the main PCB. If we look at where the power comes in, the EMI transient filter is pretty normal, nothing too crazy going on here. There is one thing that is missing on this section. Generally, in addition to having a fuse here for voltage protection, there's what's called an MOV, or a metal oxide varistor, and there is not one on this PSU, which means that if you happen to get voltage surges, then your PSU could go out, and possibly parts inside your computer could be affected as well. So if you are using this unit, we do recommend that you get a surge protector or a UPS unit, which that's just good practice anyway. As we go past the filter, we hit the rectifiers here. These turn the AC to DC for us. And then from the rectifiers, we go to the active power factor correction area over here. In the active power factor correction area, we have a couple of caps here, and these caps are by Cap Exxon. Get a little shot of that right there. These guys are 270 microfarad, 420 volt, and there's a pair of them here, so we get 540 microfarad total. Not exactly super strong for bolt caps. Could have probably done a little bit more, but what we're going to see as we go through this thing is that they've kind of bargain selected some of the components. As we move from the APFC, we then go back to the other side of this thing, and just inside between the transformer and on the inside of this heatsink, you can see there is a what looks like a diode, or in this case it's a transistor, and there's a pair of them there. These guys are set up in what's called a double forward converter configuration. Usually what we're used to seeing is an LLC converter for this part of the power supply, and this double forward is known to be less efficient. And again, we're going to see that when we look at the numbers on efficiency in just a minute. As we go across from there, we hit the main transformer. The transformer then dumps us over to the rectification for the outputs, and we have the 12 volt rectification, and then over here on this little board we've got 3.3 volt and 5 volt rectification, and then we have output filtering caps all around the area here. The output filtering caps are from a company named JSH for these conductive polymers, and we couldn't find any information on those at all. And then we found some Asia X capacitors here and here. There are 4 of the taller ones and 2 of the smaller ones. The Asia X caps, like other components, aren't the best for selection. And then if we look at the 3.3 volt and the 5 volt, we run into a brand named XCon. And then, I don't know if we can even get down this. There's another one. In addition to this solid polymer cap, there are 4 like this one on the bottom, and the XCons are up here, and the 4 on the bottom again are at JSH. On the output filtering, the capacitor selection leaves something to be desired, and that I think you're going to see that is going to come to bear in all the testing, that none of the numbers look great. There is an NTC thermistor, and usually this guy has an associated relay with it, and there is no relay on this particular power supply, and that relay helps to boost efficiency after the power supply is already started up. So just one more thing that's kind of missing on this PSU.
Back to my side to talk about efficiency for a bit. So the AGS850, again, it's advertised 80 plus gold. It's possible that the unit sent to Clear Result, the custodian for the 80 plus standard, tested to that standard. They do have it listed. It is an issued certificate. Everything looks about as legit as it can look from Clear Result side. So it's possible that it worked. But based on the quality of the internal components and the performance of the unit in our testing, it's unlikely that the units in circulation will perform to that level. We bought this retail. Our sample certainly didn't anyway. At 10% load, the unit tested at Clear Results reported 86.23%, while our sample from Amazon came in at about 5 percentage points lower at 81.8% for efficiency at 10%. At 20% load, the officially submitted unit registered 89.98% efficiency. In our comparable test, the power supply only delivered 85.8% efficiency. These numbers might not sound like big differences, but they are literally the tiers of 80 plus efficiency ratings. That's the entire point of them, and not much separates one from the next, at least numerically. The next marker for 80 plus is 50% load. The Clear Result test noted an efficiency of 91.26, and the GN unit only hit in our testing 87.4%. Big difference. The final checkpoint for 80 plus is 100% load, and here the sample submitted by AresGame registered 89.01% efficiency. Our lab tests, we saw considerably lower results at 81.8% efficiency. Comparing the two graphs, it's easy to see that there's a discrepancy. If our testing results here are representative of the whole, then The end result is that this power supply, as it stands here, only qualifies for 80 plus white label, meaning not even bronze. If we account for margin of error and for differences in devices, chroma versus the Sun Moon, for example, perhaps, if we're being generous, we'll say that it's basically 80 plus bronze. In fact, we'll just go ahead and say it's pretty close to 80 plus bronze, and perhaps with the exact same testing rig, we could draw that line, but it's certainly not 80 plus gold, even with device differences. Now, on this content, we worked with a couple of power supply engineers in the industry to cross-validate, as you do when you're trying to do good science, and they found similar results to ours. They found also about 80 plus bronze, plus or minus a little bit into the white label territory, and ultimately it's pretty simple. The only way to get prices lower, like this unit, is to sacrifice quality. And that's what's happened here. As for load regulation, as noted earlier, we don't have anything on transient response yet, but we do have some stability information to share. The voltage regulation at different loads saw amounts of variance beyond our desired specifications. Preferably, we'd like to see less than 2% variation on all rails except for the 12 volt rail. For 12 volts, we consider less than 1% to be ideal. On 12 volts, we had 1.8% difference between our highest and lowest loads, not quite up to our standards. For 5 volts, our test yielded a 2.6% difference, coming in very close to our standard. At 3.3 volts, we tallied a 4.2% difference, and on the 5 volt standby rail, our tests registered 3.2% difference. If we're aiming for a 2% variation on these rails, then those numbers don't make the cut. The other piece of stability information we have is the data on voltage ripple. Here we take a look at not only the ripple that remains from AC to DC conversion, but also the noise surrounding the ripple. Almost any power supply is going to meet the Intel Multi-Rail Desktop Power Supply Design Guide specifications, which ask for a maximum of 120 millivolts peak to peak on 12 volts and 50 millivolts peak to peak on 5 volts, 5 VSB, and 3.3 volts. This guide is kind of ridiculous. It's very out of date. Those numbers are maybe suitable for a super cheap OEM build that doesn't use enthusiast class parts, but the tolerances should be tightened for what most people on our channel are likely going to use. Our standards are considerably higher. We want to see a 30 millivolt peak to peak and 25 millivolt peak to peak being our respective goals for those voltages. We have leeway up to 80 millivolts for worse or bad power supplies that might not be powering heavy overclocks, but AresGame does explicitly mention in its manual and advertising that overclocking to the peak is part of its goal. That means it needs to be closer to the stricter side. Like most power supplies, voltage ripple on this unit got worse as we increased the load. At 100% load, the 12 volt rail stayed within Intel's spec at 98 millivolts, but was woefully outside of our expectations. All three of the other rails at 5 volts, 3.3 volts, and 5 VSB missed Intel's standard mark, registering 58, 52, and 74 millivolts respectively. These numbers were also outside of our desired measurements, as you'd expect because they're more strict. This appears to be a simple case of component quality. Voltage ripple can be reduced with better components and tighter design requirements, neither of which we're seeing in the review of this power supply.
Moving over to the cooling fan, it's a 140 millimeter cooling fan. When we open this thing up to check the claims on the box said this is a hydraulic bearing fan. So we decided we would go ahead and take out this little piece right here, which is basically a rubber stopper and then some clips that hold it in place, and just sort of pull this apart, just to check out if we could see anything that looked like hydraulic bearings. And what we found instead was what basically looks like a sleeve bearing. So one more thing about the power supply where it says one thing and isn't exactly that.
On to protection testing. We haven't quite gotten the whole suite mentioned in the ATX Multi-Rail Desktop Power Supply Design Guide covered, but we're making progress. For this unit, we added SCP, or short circuit protection testing, and we hope to be able to add OTP testing next, with OVP and UVP following afterward. Let's see what Patrick found.
For SCP, we took advantage of some built-in functionality on the SM8800. We were able to verify that every connector on the AGS850 responded correctly to short circuit protection by simply clicking these blue buttons here. Each one of them tests a different connector, and when you hear that click, that creates a short and the power supply should shut down. In testing OCP, we saw trip points that ranged from 112% on the plus 12 volt rail to 149% on the plus 5 volt rail. The plus 3.3 volt rail had a similar trip point to the plus 5 volt rail at 146%, while the plus 5 VSB rail tripped at 126%. We'd like to see the trip points for the +5 and +3.3 volt lowered to be more in line with the +12 volt if AresGame makes a second edition of this unit. Permitting the OPP limit to reach 150% is too high. We're hopeful that the units in circulation are more like the one we tested. Our unit tripped OPP at 938.5 watts, or about 110.4%. That's a desirable OPP value that's thankfully nowhere near under 50%.
A couple small positive notes to reemphasize here. So AresGame did have good YouTube documentation and a good starter guide. That's actually a great effort to see some materials to help new builders, more likely their audience anyway. So we did like seeing some of the guides, and we didn't have any problem with the ones that we saw. We also like that the protections seem to work without exploding preemptively. That's always a good sign. So they are doing well there, no catastrophic failures. Ripple and regulation were suboptimal for OC, but technically everything is kind of okay as long as it's marketed properly. If this is marketed as 80 plus white label or bronze, it pretty much resolves the issues we've had with it, although they do need to make sure the fan bearing matches the marketing as well. We ultimately need to see a new listing for this entirely on Amazon because it's basically a new SKU if they do launch a bronze or a white label one. And we would want to see a resolution for customers who thought they bought 80 plus gold and ended up with something else, although Amazon will probably reinforce you there. Unfortunately, Amazon likely just throws a lot of this stuff straight in the trash once it gets a return. If our tests, again, are indicative of the products in circulation, then that's bad. It's lying at that point to call this 80 plus gold because that is factually inaccurate and it's not even close. We're not within margin of error. We're not even close to margin of error. It's bronze or white label. So where the 80 plus gold certification came from in terms of the unit, we don't know. When you send the power supply out, you're not sending one, say, every 500 units. You send one, and then that's it. And it's possible some of you, if you bought this, got one similar to that golden sample, if maybe the whole batch was golden. It's also possible that that was the only one, and now they're all like ours, where it's completely out of line with what the marketing states. So when I was talking with Patrick, when we got to the end of this process, the question I asked him after he did all the testing, looked at everything, and we sort of talked through it was, ignoring the marketing, is this still something you would feel comfortable buying? Let's pretend it's a $70, 850 watt, 80 plus bronze power supply. They've listed it maybe more realistically. Can we still make a recommendation to viewers? That was my question to him. And he said it's not a great power supply. I said, okay. So what is it? And after some thought, he said he wouldn't even call it a good power supply, and I agreed. It would therefore end up with the glorious GN. It's sort of fine asterisk, where the asterisk is, this is a power component, and therefore we do not feel comfortable telling you that it's fine. Because who knows? On one sample, we don't really know if there's any sort of catastrophic failure in the future. If it were a CPU cooler and it scored, it's fine in our rankings, it's easier to say, well, it's fine, you can go ahead and buy it if you want. But here we don't feel comfortable saying that we would recommend this for really any particular audience. Sometimes we can say, well, if you're really on a budget, it's fine, we can recommend it, but we're not saying that here, can't make that commitment. If you actually need 850 watts, and most people don't, so double check that, then it's probably better to spend a little bit more and get better quality. If you just need the power supply to power a basic PC or a low-end gaming PC, maybe this works. It probably is actually fine there. We wouldn't pair it with high power consuming or expensive components. This is definitely not a good overclocking choice though. Not something we can recommend. We don't completely hate it. The marketing is not correct though. It's not 80 plus gold. That's the end of the story. So thanks for watching as always. You can leave comments below to request another power supply for this series. We're excited to be doing more of these. We have a lot to learn. So we're gonna be working on improving our methodology, adding more tests, improving sort of charting, data presentation. We're still playing around with all that stuff. Ton to learn here, but we think we have a pretty good foundation and we've got excellent resources in the industry we can talk with and try to learn from, and certainly we're gonna be learning as we test more of these. So thank you for the support in this type of content. It's a lot of fun for us. We look forward to doing more. And as always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by grabbing a mod mat, mouse mat, or other item, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. We actually have several behind the scenes videos talking about the power supply equipment and testing that Patrick has hosted. So check those out on Patreon if you want to support us directly. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.